The scientific revolution starts now.
This is the First Joy Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Let's go back to the mid-1990s. Major events in world history and climatic history. We had two El Niños back to back in the mid-1990s. And El Niño events warm up the Pacific Ocean, the North Pacific at least, and shift the currents around in the South Pacific. And El Niños typically have a 2-year warming period, and you have 2 or 3 years cooling, and then you go back to sort of another El Niño event. You have this sort of cycle. You go back for over 100 years in Japanese fishing records, and you can see this. Well, we had two almost back to back in the mid-90s. And we had the scare of global warming. Al Gore, tipping point, the whole thing. Everybody remembers the story. We don't say global warming anymore because we say climatic change. Because around 2000, the oceans cooled dramatically. Well, in the mid-1990s, tens of thousands of salmon would leave a stream or river. Dozens would come back, if that. And there was near extinction events for salmon on the Pacific coast, meaning from California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And the salmon were the bread and butter for the whole system, because the bears fed on salmon, the insects, the birds, everything fed on the salmon. And I was involved in the conservation community, called the Salmon Conservation Community, which included indigenous peoples, anglers, and just like do-gooders. And I was kind of, a bit of all of them. And I was out there doing, boots in the mud, planting up trees. And we just had what was the moment with the presidential debate where looking for the fly on the head? Vice presidential debate. We just had that moment. So anyway, going back to my narrative.
Sorry, yeah, there's actually a fly landing on my face. Yeah.
I was a do-gooder out there. And one of the things that I looked at the studies, I was reading the reports, and they said that the migrations of animals had changed. And that was caused by global warming. And that was one of those things out there. You might have remembered the stories, and that was causing the death of salmon, invertebrates, migratory birds, and all that sort of stuff. Well, 2000 came along, the oceans cooled, and the juveniles that went out to the ocean salmon did very well. We had record salmon returns. Historically, we never had anything like that. And went back to the stories of people who were walking across streams, stepping on the salmon like they would rocks. But the timing of the animals kept shifting back and forth, just as they were in the mid-1990s. So the so-called global warming at that time did not shift the animals, at least the migration timing. So I asked that question to myself, and I looked at it from multiple perspectives. I looked at it from chronobiology, endocrinology. What are the rhythms? What are they driven by? I looked at it from the salmon migration periods. And it was probably 2002. It was Christmas Eve at like 11 o'clock. My daughter was 1 or so years old. She was tucked in bed. And I'm in my office, and I had papers all over the wall. Remember that Beautiful Mind moment with Graham Nash? He's connected all these papers. Totally insane. And some of it made sense, but most of it didn't. That's what my office was like. And I looked at all these papers, and I said, I got it. And not only did I get it for the salmon, but I had it for the whole span of animals. So I slept, snugly that night in my bed and woke up the Christmas morning. And the next day I called, someone had been communicating with. His name was John Palmer. And he, at that time, I assume he's still living, was the world's foremost biological clock scientist, or there's many words. We'll call biological clock scientists. And I asked him a question that a recognition I had made that Christmas Eve night at almost midnight. And there was a blank silence on the end of the phone. It was a blank silence for at least a minute. At least I felt like for at least a minute. And I thought he had hung up. Okay. And I said, John, Dr. Palmer, are you there? And he said, I can't believe we all missed it. And that response to him, the question I gave to him, the response that he gave back, completely changed my direction in life. Not only how I view the world, but how I was going to pursue my bliss.
What was the question?
There you go. Okay. The question was, salmon migrate by the light or the dark signals, both the sun and the moon, and it's driven by their pineal body. And unlike humans, we fall asleep during the night. That's the melatonin is our night cycle, and we wake up when the light wakes us up. When the light drives that, turns off the melatonin. Salmon have just the opposite. Okay, and this was known as like pharmacology circles because they use trout to study pharmacology. It's one of the main animals, and so that would suggest that salmon would migrate more prolifically during the nighttime, and less during the light during the day, and that salmon would also migrate, would slow their migration during like light nights, let's say around a full moon, just as they do during the daytime. And Palmer had that already. I mean, he'd written books about this, dozens, at least hundreds of papers. And then I said, the question was, because we had that established from previous conversations. And I said, what if, physics speaking, astronomically speaking, the moon is out of sync with the sun. The cycle of the yearly cycle, the year of the sun is 365 or so days. The moon is 29 and a half days, light and dark cycles. 12 times 29 and a half is 11 days short of 365. So if a salmon migration peaked during the dark moon of January 14th, year one, potentially it would peak during January 13th, the next year. Okay. So what was driving the difference in migration patterns of animals across the biological spectrum was they're both solar timed. And everybody had been looking at them just as like lunar animals, lunar timing, but nobody had tied them apparently into the solar combination of the two, except indigenous peoples around the world. And so this set me on a different trajectory. And one of the mistakes I made was Palmer said, we should publish this. And I was writing a book, Biological Time, and I had like a bigger hypothesis, a big theory, a big story called and so I should have taken up his offer because he had already been in the major journals, Science, Nature, and things like that. And he was the first person to show that magnetism affected the human mind. And he became like famous for that. His big regret in life was not that we didn't go publish together, but he didn't get a Nobel Prize because he thought he was going to get one. But anyway, Palmer, he helped me through this process, as well as other people in these different fields, and basically worked out a universal hypothesis that animals are timed by light and dark cycles, which was already in the literature, and that there was multiple studies from indigenous cultures that indigenous cultures fed it to an anthropologist who then wrote stories about they go collect the eggs of a bird during the full moon period or something like, or the dark moon period. So this was already in the literature in different perspectives. But what I did is I said, okay, I had a few steps in this. The next step in it was, if they're migrating earlier or later for one year or the next, then they're going to have different success rates. So if the salmon migrate out to the Pacific Ocean during a warm period, sort of El Nino, they're all going to die. And they did. They died, the ones that migrated early. And the ones that migrate later will then have greater success rates. And it works just the opposite in Alaska, because Alaska already has cooler oceans. So they actually wanted the warmer oceans. So during the mid 90s, when salmon were dying off on the Pacific, Oregon, Washington, California, BC, bumper years in Alaska. And so I proposed the concept that we should be able to, so because we can see when the animals will go out to the ocean earlier or later, and multiple species of birds migrations, we should be able to tell or predict, based on the data, success rates of animals into the future. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And this is the reason why. Because the animals, so let's say these salmon they migrate into, they spawn in January 14th. Well, they can't keep going back in time, because then they fall out of the window for them to meet other biological events that they're tied to, for food sources and so on. So salmon that would typically migrate in January 14th can't keep going back in time 11 days to be in October, September, because they just can't do it. So they have their own way of synchronizing, resetting their clocks. And it happens every 4 years, because we can just think about 4-year cycles, the calendars of the Hebrews and so on. But the 4th year, it doesn't always, it could go one way or the other. And so I can tell you 2 years, and I can tell you 3 years. I can't tell you the 4th year, which resets the whole thing. So indigenous peoples around the world had a methodology to approach this problem. So indigenous peoples around the world had a way to compensate for this. And what they did is they had an early season re-indexing species. So in the Columbia Basin where I live, this indexing species were swallows. And they would say 4 days after the swallows arrive, the first spring salmon arrive. And we can go around the world, we can find different re-indexed species, whether they're in the early spring or the late fall. So, for example, the Thompson Indians in British Columbia used the rut of the black-tailed deer to then reset their calendar, their lunar calendar, for the rest of the year. And the lunar calendar, just like every other lunar calendar that people have, indigenous peoples, have all their major biological events of the animals. So it'd be the rutting of the deer, would it be the dropping of the young, it'd be the dropping of the antlers. And of course include salmon at different points in the system. So I'm writing a book, and then I hired a guy. I'm dyslexic. Yeah, you didn't know that, but that's right. I'm dyslexic. So writing for me is, I can write a paragraph out, then have to go back and read it, and I can't understand what I wrote. And so I have to rewrite things over and over and over again, which is why I don't write too many books. Well, I hired an editor out of Oregon State. I'm in Portland, and he was a stylish editor, one would say. And he said to me, you should start thinking about the cave art in Europe, because you're talking about indigenous people here in calendars. Maybe they have the same. So at that time, Lascaux Cave was kind of a well-documented cave that's in France about 17,000 years ago. And I looked at the image of Lascaux, and I looked at the biological states or conditions of the animals, and they were exact matches for the calendars of indigenous peoples in North America and Siberia, which makes sense because the animals, when they mate, when they drop their young, hasn't changed in 17,000 years. It hasn't changed.
In terms of the sense of how it's tied to the lunar and solar cycles.
Yes. So it's basic recognition among indigenous peoples, something that we lost as we went to a solar calendar, which was really about collecting taxes and civil management. We lost that connection.
Let me see if I can understand, if I got this straight. So the salmon are following a simple stimuli, and that stimuli has phase locking with the moon and the sun, where sometimes it's more one year than other year. But you're saying that they reset every once in a while because they can't follow that. It would essentially drag their spawning earlier and earlier, and it would just be out of step with the natural environment. And so they reset? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So they follow actually solar and lunar cues. So the sun has its own, as we know, we're just past the summer solstice, and we have a lot of light. Okay. So the sun has its own cues, which reset the time of day and how much light and darkness of the moon that the animals will receive. So that is a resetting device.
The moon is less bright. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's less hours of evening because the day length has become shorter, has become longer, or shorter in either case.
And you're basically saying that the migratory patterns are triggered by day length, but there's also this aspect of success that has to do with water temperature and everything else. And so as the amount of light at night shifts, as the lunar cycle translates across the solar cycle, you're going to get differential success, because when there's increased light at night, when the moon is bright and the temperatures are right for the migration patterns, you might not get as much success because the bright light at night is messing with their patterns.
Well, they might have that success because they've shifted. Well, actually, the success is tied to the environmental extremes that they hit on one side or the other. So, for example, if the deer young drop too early, it could be too much snow and not enough food. If they drop too late, they might not have enough time to get up and go with the herd, as a concept. Now, what Palmer said to me way back then, when you have to stop talking about day length, you have to talk about night length, because melatonin is the natural cycle. the light turns it off. And when you go to think about night length, then night length is partly determined by, in the natural environment, in the real world, by the moon. And so in laboratory situations, circadian rhythms, they have 12 off, 11 off, 13 on, that sort of stuff. What they don't do is they don't typically introduce light within that that nighttime cycle. And so there was a laboratory, there were many laboratory tests that were done that proved this whole thing out, but nobody had put together the pieces to put into the outside world. I remember interviewing a pharmacologist, or actually he's a physiologist, pharmacologist, and he said, and I explained this whole thing to me, he says, people don't know that already. They don't know that because they don't read pharmacology journals. It's not their world. So that was kind of my leap forwards, and it connected both this biological world, and I went to conferences, I gave presentations to the Fish and Wildlife agencies, universities. I never got as far south as Ashland, but I did go to Eugene and Corvallis, and I sort of went on this sort of tour. I was interviewed on Oregon Public Radio, and it passed up to PBS, and so like my sister or something heard it, on PBS, and they're like, well, that's my brother, because it was a fascinating story. And for years going forwards, I would be in circles, I'd hear about the story, but people didn't connect it to me. They connected to this guy who was, looking at salmon in the rivers. And I spent a lot of time with Oregon Fish and Wildlife. I walked the streams. I saw how the data was collected and all that sort of stuff. So I gave presentations to a lot of groups, including the tribes in the Columbia Basin. Okay. And I stood before the tribes and I gave this whole narrative about the biological clocks and the salmon and so forth. And Indians were in tears. They were absolutely in tears because they lost it in the residential schools. So they had these hunter-gatherer traditions, but they lost the calendars. So they knew that this time of year you went out and did this. But what they didn't remember was it was a lunar calendar that you're supposed to follow. And I would ask the Indians, I could say Indians, that's okay, among the Indians. I would ask them, how do you keep this knowledge? And everyone told me the same story.
Hey guys, if you like what's going on here, consider helping us keep it going. We are entirely listener supported. That means we don't have sponsors, we don't have external advertisements, and we want to keep it like that. So check out our Patreon world over at patreon.com/demystifysci. It's a really cool, tight-knit community. We get together every week and learn what people are exploring in the world of science and consciousness and atomics. And we get ideas for how to make the show better. But if you can't give any money right now, that's totally cool. You like the show, share it with somebody you think would also like it. That's how we grow. That's how we get better and better guests. If you want to come over and hang out at Discord, we've got a continual conversation going there on almost every subject you can imagine. We have a Facebook page, and you could just leave a comment down below, and we'll try to be in touch. We're definitely reading the comments, even if we don't have time to respond to all of them. But we're here, and we want to be in contact with you. So let's make it happen.
The story is about two mountains that fight over, Mount Adams and Mount Hood volcanically fight with each other, okay, over a girl, which is Mount St. Helens. And the coyote saves the salmon by taking away the rocks in the river, which became known as the Bridge of the Gods, which is now there's an actual bridge there. Clark crosses, and this has something to do with swallow sisters, and the swallows precede the salmon. Well, I didn't get that for a long time because it was their mythology. Because I was looking at it from a naturalist, all about the numbers, and this was a native tradition. Is how they passed on the information, and it's a lot more meaning to that. And then there was one presentation I gave to a tribe, and this is the Umatilla. And the Umatilla are they're in the sort of middle upper Columbia River. And these are political people. Okay. These are the people that were all over Kennewick Man. They were the driving force why nobody's going to tear apart our ancient man to take out and what the issue wasn't so much about Kennewick Man, is that people start talking about taking away indigenous land, Native American land, including theirs, over Kennewick Man. Because Kennewick Man's a white guy, came from someplace else. White people were here first. That was the narrative. And so I stood before the tribe.
Wait, can you lay this out? I don't know. I'm not familiar with this Kennewick
Man. Oh,
Man?
Kennewick Man. Oh, okay. So there was a skull found And the skull, I think, was about dated to maybe 20,000, maybe 16, 17,000 years old. It was found in Kennewick on the Columbia River. And Kennewick Man was, anthropologists came in and said, that's not an Indian. And they tied it to people in Asia who in that part of Asia would have been Caucasoid. Huge news. So the anthropologists basically took the bones, took the skull, and they said, we need time to examine this. Well, it went to the courts, and the courts determined that they had their right to examine it because it was potentially preceded Native Americans and the repatriation rights of the bones. Okay, big deal. This was a pretty huge deal, and and ultimately the Umatilla tribe gave in on this one, and they all went to Europe to have their DNA extracted and tested and matched. And it turned out, yes, this guy was Native American, and he had the same DNA as the Umatilla. So I'm here before the Umatilla tribe, and they all went to their own conversations. Actually, one conversation in their language that I had no concept of. And one of them dropped the name, Tommy Cuny Thompson. Actually, they said Tommy Thompson. Well, Tommy Cuny Thompson was an indigenous, we'll call him a Columbia Basin tribal person. And he lived down in Sligo Falls area, which you may have passed by. And he ran the longhouse. He ran the ceremony there. Everybody came down that they figured out the salmon migration for the year and who would get the downstream salmon, who would get how much, when would we stop fishing for downstream salmon so salmon could go upriver to Idaho and other places. So he was the salmon chief of sorts. Well, Tommy Thompson, so I had never heard of him. Went home, Googled him right away, found Tommy Cuny Thompson, went back he was born at that time. He died in the 1940s, and he was about 90 at the time or so. And you could trace his lineage back for a very long period of time. So Tommy Cuny Thompson had a narrative, and someone then said, how come he didn't tell us? And which I totally had no concept about. Well, I looked at this Tommy Cuny Thompson, and there was a book written. There were two books written about him. One's called "Welcome to a Salmon Fest," and it tells how Tommy Thompson followed or predicted when the salmon would come. And it was that story of the two mountains fighting with each other over a girl, includes the salmon sisters, the coyote, and the birds. And the book talks about the story. So how Tommy Cuny Thompson was telling the story or passing on that knowledge to other people was the same way everybody said it to me, but they didn't understand the biology of it. And by this time in Native American tradition in the Northwest, they were managing the hatcheries. They hired Western biologists. It was like so far away from talking about lunar time and coyotes and swallow sisters and mountains fighting with each other over a girl. So they had shifted in their traditions, partly due to residential schools. And I walked in the door, and they used to say I was spooky. Actually, they never said it to me, but they said to other people I was spooky. But they said that in a good way, it's because I had some sort of like feeling about something that they didn't have. Well, as time went by, so I'm halfway through my presentation, and they say, "You done, Bertie?" I'm like, "No, I'm not done. I haven't got to the good part yet. I haven't got to the Ice Age, Paleolithic cave art." And they said, "Okay, we'll reschedule." Well, what they did do is they invited me back to teach at their tribal schools, which was really cool because I had to share their narrative through their traditions and their rock art as well, which I had worked on. And then I was connected to we'll call him a tribal spiritual leader, and his tradition goes back for many generations. And he sat down with me and he told me the story. He told me the story of his tradition of astronomy as seen through a indigenous Animus person, because he wasn't tainted by the Western world. He knew the Greek constellations, but he only knew the Greek constellations as they related to the ones that he was born with and the ones that he was told. And from that conversation with him completely changed how I saw animistic astronomy and mythology. And that led me back to the caves years later in Spain to look at them, at the images, and just like project what he had transferred, what he had shared into this greater canvas. And so we're talking 2000. I met him 2006. I jumped back in about 2014. So my daughter is like much older by then, and she's now going off to grad school. So there's been many transitions in this. So when I look at astronomy, when I look at mythology, when I look at human psychology, I'm looking at from where we came from, not what Jung says. Oh, I'm a Jungian of sorts. Not what Ptolemy put in his Alchemist in his 48, because everything is before that, and not in just Joseph Campbell, who has his ideas of mythology, because there was mythology before Campbell, there was astronomy before Ptolemy, and there was psychology before Jung, and that's been my direction as I've looked at this sphere for a number of years now, and now I hope that I answered your question.
I think so.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I want to hear about your discoveries in terms of the roots of these ancient mythologies. But before we do that, I want to make sure that I understand this business about the sun and the moon.
Sure.
Because I'm not sure that I totally understand it. What is causing this reset every 4 years? And is that measurable? Is it synchronous? What is
the reset too?
It is synchronous. Yes, it is synchronous, but it's not measurable because it is and it isn't. Because the animals have to have certain biological events in a certain part of the solar year. Okay, it's just part of what it is. Because they have to the deer young need to drop when there's food on the ground, or there will be food on the ground. And so it's within their system that they don't drop in. Well, first of all, there's a gestation period, which is also shifting. But they don't drop their young in January because there'll be no food in the ground. Okay, and so they're tied to both the sun and the moon cycle because it's tied to melatonin. So in the wintertime, you synthesize more melatonin than you do in the summertime. Okay, it's from your pineal body. Okay, and so that melatonin is synthesized by the length of night during the seasons, as well as the length of night due to the moon. So you have two different systems. So what I couldn't do is I used a few different data sets. One was Canadian lynx, survival rates, and I was never able to work out the fourth year whether it's going to go, be one more lunation or it'll sink back, go back to the beginning. I was never able to do it. But you look at calendars around the world, as they or we'll call structured calendars like the Hebrew calendar, they just say 4 years, we go back again. And it sort of works. What indigenous people did is they never figured it out. What I tried to do, what they said is, we're just going to follow some sort of indexing species that comes early in the year that then resets the calendar for the rest of the year.
Well, I mean, I follow that. So basically, the indigenous Native American way was to be like, okay, so we have these index species. When the index species arrives, that's when we start to count, because we know that there's this specific gap between the arrival of the first species and the arrival of the next species.
Yes.
The thing that I think that Shilo is trying to get at is that you're like, there's this thing that happens at the fourth year, and I can't tell if it is what exactly that thing is.
Like the biological event that causes them to recognize this?
Or what is it that they're recognizing? Because I understand that there's going to be a drift in the cycle, and that you can deal with the drift by just creating this floating indicator, right? That's just reacting to the environment. But what's this 4-year thing? So
it becomes a 4-year cycle because you can't go back. It's the 3 to 4 year cycle, because they can't go back or further within the solar year, because they move out of their windows. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what ancient peoples did is they created a 4-year cycle, but there really isn't a 4-year cycle.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So basically, like, look, after 4 years of lunar drift over the solar calendar, mm-hmm. you end up in a position where you're so far off of your climate conditions.
Yes. Your solar year, that you have to basically make some kind of concerted shift that is setting you, it basically brings you back to an earlier lunar cycle. And so you can start, then you start the drift backwards again, and then you reset and you drift again. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So it works two. That's one way that it works. If a species synchronizes their mating and and their dropping of the young within a very narrow period of time, that's exactly how it works. But how it works for salmon is that they will typically salmon will drop their spawn over 2 lunations, and as the juveniles grow, mature, they will get split into 3 or 4 lunations, because some grow faster than others. One gets behind a better rock than another, right? And then what happens is that they get tied to that same sort of lunar cycle stuff, that they range over 4 or 5 lunations. And so it's an evolutionary check to make sure that animals aren't tied to one specific lunation that goes too earlier in the year and they all die off. Okay.
But you're suggesting the ones that are in the lunation that is too early will die off.
Yeah.
And you have really good bumper years when that entire 4 or 5 month cycle is late enough in the year that the conditions in the open ocean are going to be good and the conditions in the river are going to be good when the cycle finally completes over that same couple of month window.
Yes. And so what happened in the mid 1990s was coho salmon, which they'll come back. They all come back. The juveniles will come back as adults 2 years later, whereas Chinooks and other salmon might be 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. So they have a better evolutionary strategy. Let's put it that way. But the Chinook come back in huge numbers when they come, and so the Chinook were the ones who were down to dozens coming back to a stream or less. And those are the ones that they thought potential extinction events, because they wouldn't have new Chinook to come out because we had these 2 El Niños back to back. Now, there was work done at Oregon State by Norm Anderson, who's now deceased, and he was an aquatic entomologist. And he had a paper published in Nature in the 1960s. And what he showed is that invertebrates in the river had the same, there's huge migration during the dark of the moon, and there was no migration during the light of the moon. And his work was important to me because this just wasn't a tidal factor. It was driving the salmon to go up the rivers, but invertebrates that were in the rivers had the same activity. So this became across the biological spectrum. And of course, at that time, we had the evidence of migratory birds beginning their migratory flight, let's say under the dark of the moon, because that was their strategy. So the evidence was, the evidence was all there. It was like huge amount of evidence. I could literally go to journals. I can pull the dates out, and I can graph it out with the moon, because people weren't looking at it from that perspective at that time. And I was out there. I mean, I was way out there. But over time, it settled down.
By the way, what were you doing? What was your professional occupation when you were doing all of this work?
No relationship to any of it. Absolutely none.
So you were just you were fascinated by this topic, and you were corresponding with the scientists as just a reader, essentially.
Absolutely. And they became very interested in the topic, such as Palmer, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and they took me in because they realized, they looked at their numbers on the charts, and there was no, some of the stuff was at the 4th and 5th decimal places. This was what you get in engineering studies. And when they did, so yes, it was just it was fun for me. I was in the salmon conservation community, and not everybody in the salmon conservation community actually ate salmon or fishing for salmon or whatever. And so I was in the mix, and this just fascinated me. And then I became engaged with the tribes, and then that brought so much more information to and then I said, my daughter was like, so this is 2005 or 2006. I wrote a bunch of papers in the astronomical literature. And my daughter was
without an affiliation.
Huh?
Without a university.
Without any affiliation. Actually, 2 of them were the
That's
Griffith
crazy.
Observer, which is the under the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. And how they did it was, they did it by a competition. So it's like a few steps further than the peer review. And it's mostly NASA types writing about history of astronomy or something, not what they normally do. So you actually had to get into it. You had to win to get into it. And so I had absolutely no affiliation. But that set me up into a different place. And as I continued to write, and I've been published in the primary literature, they always ask me, what affiliation did you have when you did this? Like, well, I didn't. I was an independent scholar, and they're like, wait, how could you do it? And I said, because it was interesting to me. This is how I got my kicks. I still get my kicks this way.
Did you publish with other authors who were affiliated, or?
I didn't. Nope, didn't do it. Well,
that's incredible.
The Oregon Fish and Wildlife, the Oregon Fish and Wildlife stuff back when was it was their data, but they didn't analyze the data, I should say. So they loaned. First, actually, the data was available on the internet, which I downloaded, and then I took it to them and explained how this works, and then they gave me more data. They wanted me to publish back then some of this stuff, but and they brought me to conferences that they had me speak. But I was writing a book. I was writing the book Biological Time, so I wasn't interested in going ahead with writing papers because I was writing sort of this masterwork of how am I going to predict the future of all animal species, and I didn't. But it set me on the path. I've spoken since 2017, I've spoken at probably 25 scientific conferences, anthropology, archaeology, astronomy, organizations you would know, the IAU, and biological clocks. All the board. And I go in as an independent scholar. In the first year, this is actually a fun story. This is really fun. So the first year, I pitch these conferences, they argue about it. Okay, they argue about whether I could have this guy. And I usually knew somebody because I have some history in this. I usually knew someone, and if I got a hard time, I'd reach out to my person. And I say, go talk to them. Okay, and they reluctantly agree, and they throw me in the poster pile. Okay, you know how it works. Okay, you've been there. When you were undergrad or graduate student, you got thrown in the poster pile, right? Okay, and then the second year I come back, and they were interested, and they put me on the speaker list, but I'd be the 10th out of 10, right? In the session. And then the third year coming back, this is actually multiple conferences and multiple associations. I'm the first of the first. I'm the first of the 10th. And then what's happened now is I'm actually invited to the conferences, and actually not to the conferences, by the session organizers to speak in their session because they want to hear my stuff. And many of these conferences are in Europe, and we've moved out of the pandemic, and I'm not going to Greece or Romania or whatever it is to speak for 15 minutes at the conference. And so they say, okay, we'll have both names on it, and you send us a recording, and we'll just run the recording, even though it is then a mandatory in-person conference. And so there's been stages of this, okay, and I've started sort of like how you would treat a poor undergraduate, and then graduate, PhD, doc, and the whole thing. But yeah, it's I've been invited to speak at many universities, usually in astronomy, to talk about the history of astronomy pre-Ptolemy, pre-Greeks, and tying it into with indigenous sort of stuff. And my biggest challenge, I'm going to tell you right now, is not getting into conferences and getting published. It's defending my previous published work against people who are now publishing the exact same thing, the same hypotheses that I have going back to 2005. And I've challenged. I sent you guys over a link, and I did last January, a paper came out in Cambridge Archaeological Journal, and it came out of Durham University, and the media just all over the world picked this thing up that somebody has discovered how to read cave art and other iconography. Well, those guys didn't discover anything. Okay, going back in time is I had everything that they had, including most of the images they published. I did that back in 2005, and so I called bunk on it, and I said, let's okay, you guys. You can't rewrite me into the paper. I get it. So why don't we do this? Why don't you invite me to give a paper for I have? And why don't you invite me to present on another topic so we all walk away, everybody wins? Well, the journal came back and they said, well, before the journal came back, something interesting happened. Nova, Nova PBS, it was like the BBC of America. The editor, one of the editors, I won't name, but you have sent you the name. He read Biological Time back in 2005. And he called, and this crew from Durham University came to him to do a PBS Nova documentary. And he said, well, Bernie did this back in 2005. And not only did he do this, but he included a lot of indigenous knowledge and biological knowledge, which you have nothing of. You're just throwing numbers at me. I didn't know that until a few days after. Apparently, the Nova editor saw the stuff in the press, and he reached directly out to me and says, "You don't know me, but I have 2 copies of your book on my shelf, and I read it a long time ago. And this is what happened. These guys came to me, basically the story I just told you. So they a year before they went to press, they knew that I had the whole story. They knew that I had the story, that the Nova people had it. They knew that it was in multiple publications, and in many hundreds of thousands of people had heard me present the subject on YouTube interviews, podcasts, and in presentations in different forums. So my issue right now is not my path forwards to who's going to listen, but rather who listens too much and who doesn't give me credit for what I've done. But fortunately, I've had people that have backed me up, like the Nova people and others, and they've kind of given me, this is the way to do this. So that is incredible, isn't it?
Was there a big difference in the mechanism that they proposed in the Durham paper versus the mechanism that you would?
They had no mechanism. Biological. They had no mechanism.
Or
they just
the interpretation of.
No.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that from what I understand, the Durham study was this examination of cave art and suggesting that there were these dots that were on the cave art that were keeping lunar time, and in the paper was presented as a completely novel claim that nobody had ever seen before.
Yes.
But you're saying that when you wrote this book in 2005, you actually had gone through and you had pointed out that cave art was keeping track of lunar cycles. Had you pointed to the same evidence, or
the same images? They have the same images. So not just 2005, but the book, but the papers in the Griffith Observatory book in 2017. It's on Wikipedia. It's on Wikimedia. It was a paper that was published in an archaeology journal in Hungary, a European archaeology journal, the year before they went to print in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. So this wasn't just one thing that I wrote on a napkin. This was multiple papers over a very long period of time that was recognized by multiple sources and was in the media. Now, the major author, Paul Petit from Durham University, he's a Facebook friend of mine. Okay, how could he have not seen it? Because if you look at my Facebook, I just all my stuff has been thrown at him as a Facebook friend. You just get thrown stuff, right? And I've got a lot of stuff in I had on this topic. So it turns out they did know. They knew long before a year that the year before they met the Nova editor. Okay, so but what they wanted is they wanted to be famous. You can Google the 7 deadly sins, and you're going to probably come up with a few good reasons, their reasons or mentality why they thought they can get away with it. But they made a lot of mistakes, including trying to steal from me. But they literally went to PBS with stolen property, really stolen IP property, and they tried to sell it. And PBS said, "That's not how we do business here. We don't care what university, whether it's a Cambridge Journal or Durham University. We don't care. We go to the primary sources. We give priority to publication." And that is the way it's actually supposed to work. But these guys, they didn't see it that way. They thought they were going to get away with it. So that was that was the first one I actually called out. Like I said, no way.
On some level, I can understand that it's super frustrating, but on another level, is there a part of you that's satisfied that you got it right?
Oh, not only to get it right, but what happened is that, not only to get it right, but people in their space quickly became alerted to my paper. And within the first week or so, I had over 1,000 views on my Academia U, that paper that was uploaded to Academia U. That prior to that, maybe 30 people read, because nobody reads this stuff. But they only read it if there's a controversy. Okay. And so when I put the notice out that everybody, you gotta go read my stuff and make sure that you're not going to pirate it in the future. So I have the academic edu version that I can see who reads my stuff. So you pay $80 a year, and the editors of everything have gone on there and they've read through my papers to make sure it's not going to happen to them. That they can't. That the Cambridge Archaeological Journal had faith in this team of authors that they told the truth, and they didn't tell the truth. They didn't tell the truth. They didn't fess up what they knew until they got called out on it. In fact, the first few days in this conversation of this, they denied everything, and then the notification came over to me, and I sent them and said, "Well, maybe that happened. We don't really remember. I mean, we're going through this one thing after the other." And then I showed, well, this isn't Wikipedia. This isn't Wikipedia. So you didn't see this when you were doing your literature search. So it's not yet concluded. But what has happened though is that this incident, which I'm not really frustrated about, because it's put out there, hands off. If you're gonna work with my stuff, I'm good with that. But you have to give me credit. And don't steal my interpretations. I don't mean just general interpretations. We use the same images. Now, it's 25% of their work that I didn't have. And it turns out that a French anthropologist did a study on, let's say, 25% of it. And he found that they actually used doctored images because they were all illustrations that were not connected to the actual images from the photographs in the cave walls. And so 25% of their data was literally contrived. And so I don't claim any ownership of that stuff. Yeah, but that's where I am. But my work has progressed much further than both the biological time work. It goes back to 2005 and this Cambridge Durham incident, because I've moved on more into the mythology, and I've moved on into the astronomy, which was our original program for today.
Yeah,
the bug. You ate the bug.
I really want to learn about. I mean, I think the natural life cycles are fascinating too, but I really am curious what you think is being encoded in these ancient myths.
Absolutely. So there's different elements, and one element is psychological, so that we have we have stories that we carry with ourselves. You, as a couple, you have your stories, and there's probably millions of couples around the world that have very similar stories, and so we can't escape from those, and we incorporate those into our mythology. And what I like to do is, when I talk about origins of indigenous mythology, I like to bring in Native American astronomy, and I have a pretty good case that ties into the Upper Paleolithic work. So if you can indulge me for just 2 more minutes, because you've heard me riff for an hour. Yeah.
No, please.
So the Lakota, historically in the Black Hills region, the Great Buffalo Hunters, and the Lakota have a tradition that a band would travel in the springtime through the Black Hills, and at each point in the Black Hills, they would find a geological formation that they believed connected to the night sky. And each one of those geological formations was tied to a myth. And they have their hero is called Star Boy or Star Child. And Star Boy is it's an immaculate conception of sorts. His father is a star and his mother is a mortal. So we've heard these stories around the world. And in this Star Boy myth, he saves the souls of 7 abducted girls. Okay, and by saving their souls, he sends them to the night sky as the constellation of the star cluster, the Pleiades. And that's a story that you've heard all around the world as 7 sisters. Okay. Well, this story is a little different. Is in this story, it's tied to what's called Harney Peak, a geological formation, which if you look at it, you can find 7 peaks. And they say that the 7 peaks in Harney Peak are tied to the constellation in the night sky. And what they do is, as they travel around the Black Hills, they're traveling across the ecliptic, the parent path of the sun. And so they're seeing the Pleiades just below the horizon. Okay. And that tells them where to be in time and space. And they have about 7 or 8 points that they go around that ties to the geology. So they've connected both the mythology, they've connected to the geology and to the night sky as a constellation. Well, the next place they go to after Harney Peak and seeing the Pleiades is Bear Butte Lodge. And Everybody who's listened to this podcast knows Bear Butte Lodge, but they don't know it by that name. They know it by Devil's Tower. And if you look at Devil's Tower, you see these big marks or scratches or whatever, striations that come down. And the mythology of the Lakota, or their sacred narrative, is that they were children that were being chased by a bear, and Starboy raises them into the sky on this mount. And as the mount is being raised, or the butte, the bears claw it down. And so what you're looking at is the claw marks of the bear. Okay. Well, when they're looking at that mound, or butte among the Lakota Sioux, it also as Gemini is along the ecliptic. Okay, and so they're looking at a geological pareidolia on the an environment that finds in the Greek constellation of Gemini, which sort of looks like Devil's Tower, right? I mean, Shilo, you'll agree with that one, right? Okay, okay, it's a rectangular shape. Okay, so that's their mythology, and then they have their most sacred ceremony, which is the Sundance, and everybody has heard about the Sundance from one form and another, and again, that is the connection between the Earth, the terrestrial realm, and the night sky. So what we have among the Lakota Sioux is we have multiple constellations in the Black, or actually multiple geological formations in the Black Hills that they then find again in the night sky's constellations that they've projected. Okay, which is a fascinating narrative, because we have the same narrative in Upper Paleolithic cave art in Europe. The exact same narrative, except the places are different. And the constellations are a little different. But what you do have is you have a hero that travels around through the night sky, and that hero that we know in Greek mythology and Ptolemy is it's Orion, it's Perseus, and it's Hercules. But in Upper Paleolithic tradition, that's the same character, the same Starboy that travels through the night sky. And as he travels through the night sky, he interacts with different animals. They takes on their form, or takes on their helpfulness. Okay. So in the Paleolithic tradition, they travel. The character travels partly along the Rock of Gibraltar. And as he travels along the Rock of Gibraltar, he sees a horse, the head of a horse, and that horse ultimately becomes Pegasus. And next to actually just before he sits at the head of a horse, he sees in the rocks in the pareidolia, in the Rock of Gibraltar, he sees an eagle, and that eagle is Aquila. And so if you put Aquila and Pegasus together, or the horse together, you have a flying horse, which it's a pretty good story. And on that same Rock of Gibraltar, the length of the Rock of Gibraltar from north to south has ridges. And in the Paleolithic traditions, they found a dolphin going south, and they found a whale going north. Okay, very interesting. So after you pass Pegasus, you reach Pisces, right, in that great astronomical sea. Well, in the Paleolithic tradition, they didn't go sort of counterclockwise as the Lakota Sioux did. What they did is they went north to south and back again. And if you go north to south and back again, and if you're gonna take on the strength of the dolphin going south, you're not gonna go in his mouth on the way back. That's not how mythology works. What you do is you have another animal that goes back, and that animal is a whale. Okay, and so in this pareidolia on the Rock of Gibraltar, we have the length of it. We have a huge dolphin. We have a huge whale. Now, going back 34,000 years ago, when this mythology is our earliest record of it, the sea levels were about 30 meters shallower. So the Rock of Gibraltar would have been lifted above the sky. So from the terrestrial, they have the underworld, which is the cave. They have the Rock of Gibraltar, which is the pareidolia in the terrestrial plane, which is then projected in the night sky. That became the constellation for them was Pisces. But the Greeks came along, and Greek tradition, you can't have two constellations, overlapping each other like that. It just doesn't work. And the IEU didn't like it much better, in this past century, because you have to have everything structured in boxes where things don't overlap, and we can all say that this is in the Hercules constellation, and that's in Aquila or something, right? but you can't mix constellations in today's world. It's just not scientific. Well, the Greeks had that same problem. They tried to separate them the best they could, but Ptolemy still had overlapping constellations. So the nose of one animal might be the foot of another. Okay. You figure that out for us. But in the Upper Paleolithic tradition, it was the overlapping of the constellations or their asterisms that was the beauty of it. Because when the hero goes on his journey and overlaps with these constellations, he integrates with the horse to become a centaur of sorts. He integrates with the bird to become an avianoid, a birdman, so he can fly. He integrates with the dolphin to become a merman. Okay, that's what it is, guy. And he travels on the way back. He travels in the belly of the whale, which is a story that everybody on this podcast has heard. But of course, you can't travel in the belly of the whale. You travel in the ventral pleats of the whale, which is that forward section kind of ribbed. And even in Pinocchio, they're not really in the belly of the whale, they're in the ventral pleats. And you can see those ventral pleats as pareidolia on the Rock of Gibraltar. Okay. And so we can actually travel down through many geological formations, and they typically be the Rock of Gibraltar is one of them. Another one is Mulhacen, which is just north of there. It's the highest mountain or tallest mountain in the Iberian Peninsula. And another one is across the Strait of Gibraltar at Jebel Tobokal, which the ancient Greece called Atlas, and which the Phoenicians said that astronomy was actually founded by, of course, a Phoenician. But it wasn't. It was founded tens of thousands of years ago by Upper Paleolithic people. So what we're learning now through this brief indulgence of mine, traveled through Lakota Sioux and these Upper Paleolithic cave artists, is that all astronomy in the Northern Hemisphere is indigenous. Okay, and they all follow these basically same traditions of this pareidolia that was found in their world around them, that is then projected to the night sky. What we've lost among the Iroquois and the Apaches and others, we've lost a lot of that pareidolia connection because we've lost the people's connection to them. Okay, so we've lost some of the stories behind the stories and where the spiritual leader was standing when he was looking at those projections in the night sky. But we still have it among the Lakota. And it's very interesting why we have this among the Lakota is there was a Jesuit priest who, it was probably the turn of the last century, and he wrote it down. And he translated from the tradition into in English and brought in the Greek constellations. And this is what he said to the Lakota. He said, share his story. He said, I don't believe this. This is not in my tradition, but I recognize this is really important in your tradition and that we shouldn't lose this information. Now, was he thinking this is the origins of the Greek constellations? Of course not, because he doesn't have the information that we have today. But that was left by this Jesuit. This now becomes a story for the Lakota to share, and I've just borrowed it from them to express it through this podcast. But this is the Lakota narrative, and I've urged you to get a Lakota on the program to share their positions and how they see this. But what we can learn from Lakota, what we have in the recent anthropological evidence and in the books that were written about this going forwards, is this connection to this Animus Upper Paleolithic mind, that there's an underworld that is beyond the light line, that then transfers into the terrestrial plane where you find both the pareidolia and the actual animals, that is then found in the night sky. And that when you travel through the year, you can close your eyes and you can position your arms north to south and you can follow the story and you can follow all the constellations around the night sky as the cave artist did and as the Lakota did. You can't see, you maybe not be able to visualize all these pareidolia formations and mountains where they found this, except for, Devil's Tower. Everybody knows that one. But you can imagine this all in your head. And you can see the constellations. And so the easiest way to pass an astronomy test is to know the story. Not the story as the Greeks told the story, because the Greeks broke them all these characters into their own mythology. Their own, they go on their own journeys and stuff. There was actually one journey through the night sky. And if you can remember them, you close your eyes and you can walk the story around. And then you can explain to your professor of astronomy or physics, no, Pisces is not just one asteroid, is not just one animal. Pisces are two animals. And then the Greeks took one of the, they already had Pisces as the fish, and the Greeks took the dolphin to make it Delphinus, and they took the whale to make it Cetus. Okay, but Cetus, the sea monster, but Cetus actually wasn't ever sea monster. It was a monk seal, and we can see the pareidolia of the monk seal on the rock of Gibraltar at the north end. And so if I was a professor of astronomy, I don't think I could say no to any interpretation that was sent my way, unless I said, you got to give me a Ptolemy's 48. And then you have to show me how it was modified by the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, that was corrected from the past. So there is
it's like you're saying that the indigenous stories were there in order to recount the motion of the stars, essentially, and orient people to them.
Yes, but not just that, but also to find the connectiveness. So in the Lakota tradition, they would have a ceremony at each point, at each geological formation that they observed, and as the heliacal horizon of the constellation or the asterism. So it was their way of connecting with the great beyond.
And is it a navigational functionality that's there? Like, why would you even care what the stars are doing? So
in the case of the Lakota Sioux, it was literally Lakota. I shouldn't say Sioux because Sioux is actually a derogative word, derogative to the Lakota. In the case of Lakota, it was their ceremonial tradition. They already knew their way around the Black Hills. It's not that big, but in the Upper Paleolithic tradition, they were navigating off of it because they navigated very large distances, and where all these constellations we're talking about are north to south. I mean, you've already figured that one out. And the pareidolia are north to south aligned. So the rock of Gibraltar, it's the north end and the south end. And what's actually kind of interesting is if you go across they went across the Strait of Gibraltar with one direction with the dolphin, with the whale, but on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, and you can Google it, Jebel Musa, Jebel Jebel Musa, and Jebel means mountain, and Musa means Moses, but it's not Moses. Jebel Musa has the pareidolia of a pregnant woman, and we find that same pregnant woman in the Upper Paleolithic record, and so we know that they went across the Strait of Gibraltar, but they didn't ride in the ventral pleats of the whale, but they actually swam because only 3 or 4 hour swim. But we can see Jebel Musa, which is really cool in the Upper Paleolithic image.
I mean, it makes sense to me that you would tell stories that reflect what's happening in the sky, but there must be a lot more knowledge and wisdom embedded in these stories as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we look at these images, I learned, I consider myself a naturalist for a very long period of time, and more like a Darwin naturalist than a Teddy Roosevelt naturalist, because they're both naturalists, right? And what I learned is that when you look at the animals, you can learn an awful lot about them. You can learn seasonality. So in the case of the juvenile eagle that became Aquila, it's a fledgling golden eagle that stands about a foot tall, and it has its down, therefore it hasn't flown. And we can time that to mid-June time period, mid-June in that part of the world, which is, of course, the same as you would see this turn. I use Starry Night Pro 8, and I can turn back time. And people shouldn't be using Starry Night Pro 8. They should be using Stellarium because it's free. And that's the program. So forget I said what I did. But I can
use
turn
Starry
back
Night
time.
at my university too.
But you got to be using Stellarium because it's free for everybody to use. Right? Agree.
Yeah, I'll look into it. Yeah,
you gotta get Stellarium.
I just found out about Stellarium the other day, actually.
You got it. So you can get Zodi, Georg Zodi on your program, and he can tell you about the whole story. He'd be a great guest. So going back to the animals, I through astronomical software that uses empiricals, is that the word? But we can go back in time and we can see what they saw in that time and place. And does it match with the condition or the physical attributes of those animals? And the answer is yes, which we can tie the two together, which is kind of like really cool. And on this one image called the Gallery of Discs, most of the characters have a juvenile attached to them in one way or another, or they're associated with a juvenile. And as the hero goes on the journey, he overlaps not with the mother, but he overlaps with the juvenile. And so he picks up the attributes or the strengths he's learning from the mother, which is quite an interesting. It's not how we do things in the world today, okay? And it's certain, and thus there's only female teachers in school, which is pretty close. And it's certainly not how the ancient Greeks saw the world. You left your mother to fight with the men. But in this case, he leaves to be nurtured by other women on his journey. And at the end of his journey, he becomes a sort of cosmic man, which has all these animals within his form. And he becomes the animal, the animus, with the Jungian terms, where you have the mix of the psychological mix of the male and the female, which is another very not a Greek thing. And so when we look at Greek astronomy and we look Greek constellations under Ptolemy, we're looking at a Greek view. We're not looking. So someone asks you, what is the mythology of the constellations? Well, if you give an answer, any answer that came out of astronomy book would be, this is how the Greeks saw it in Greek mythology. But it's not the origin of the constellations in the same way. So the hero goes on his journey, both in the Lakota tradition and in the Upper Paleolithic European. It's a different story. And one story, actually the Lakota tradition and the Upper Paleolithic 34,000 years ago, is actually a much more interesting story. It's, the Greeks is going around slaying animals and raping women and all kinds of, that's the story. That's Orion, right? We know it. It is what it is. And I don't teach it, but it is what it is. But that's not the Upper Paleolithic story. And it's certainly not the Lakota story. It's about human relations. It's about learning from everybody in society. And in their society, the Iberian lynx was their cousin. And we're not that far off it from today. Do you have an animal in the house?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. Well, do bugs count as animals?
You ate the bug, right? So you have a cat or a dog? Which is it?
Yeah, we got Mingus. She's our cat. She's
okay. Have you ever celebrated Mingus' birthday?
We will usually around the time of year where we realize that she was born. Yeah. Comment on how she will die eventually, and so we mourn her short life on her birthday.
Okay. So you can't escape from animism because you are celebrating the birthday of a cat. Okay, it just isn't. It isn't a modern way of seeing the world, but we are animists to our core. Have you ever said to somebody, or thought of something, they're strong as an ox, they're smart as an owl, they're as fast as a cheetah? Those are all animist ways of seeing the world that we can't escape from because it's part of our psychology.
Well, I think that there's actually a pretty strong push to escape from that. We run across this because we do a lot of conversations about consciousness. And every time that you're talking about consciousness, there comes a point where it's a scissor statement in the conversation. And it's like, is your cat conscious or not? And there is a non-zero quantity of people, which shocks me constantly, that don't think that their animals are conscious. And so while I totally agree with you that there is this current of people that see the spirit of the animal and place it as equivalent as the spirit of the human and something that we relate to, there are other people who are like, yeah, I don't know what that is, but it's not conscious.
And unconsciously, we relate to it. So it's unconscious that we do this. So if you go to a Marvel movie and you see Spider-Man and whatever, Ant-Man or whatever on the screen, you're absorbed in the story. If Spider-Man falls down, it looks like it's going to die, you gasp. You might even cry. You're crying about animistic characters. Now think about any Disney movie with an animal,
I think that he would be a lot less sympathetic if he was actually a spider, though. Like, if you imagine just like a giant wolf spider. I feel like the thing that people resonate with, certainly he's embodying the spirit of the spider, but they're resonating with the human character.
Okay, so look at Bambi. Bambi's mother it might be before your time. Bambi's father was shot, or mother was shot, right? Was that like a
that's
happy
definitely
moment?
True.
I actually remember watching that movie in kindergarten and just like a room full of crying children afterwards.
Exactly. So, Cinderella has all these animals that help her to clean the house, right? And she sings a song, and Snow White has the same sort of episodes. Wasn't that a happy moment that the animals were helping her? And you just brought right into it. So we unconsciously, we are still animists. And we say, well, we're modern people, we're scientists, and we've put all that beside us, but we're entertained by the animus.
Okay, so there's I think you're right, but I also think that there's this really weird cleavage because on one hand there's the people who are like we should surround ourselves with more animals, we should rewild places. And then on the other hand there's people who are like no, get rid of the wolves, get rid of the bears, clear the land, make it so that humans can live there because the ranchers don't want to lose their cattle or something.
Absolutely, that's a big in fact. You're down in your part of the world. There's these issues. Well, the Native American traditions, they wanted the wolves to come back. They're the ones who brought the wolves back into Idaho, and they said that we can learn from the wolves. We learn about family relationships, about group dynamics, because the wolves teach us. And if we let go, we lose the wolves. We lost our greatest teachers. And the bear, you don't have you're not a den mother yet. You don't have Cub Scouts. You're not a protective mother bear. You're not bearish. I mean, just start throwing out the word mother bear into this conversation, and we unconsciously see ourselves within the bear. Native Americans don't like to kill bears because when you skin a bear, which I've never done, it looks like a human. Okay, and so Native Americans unconsciously connect themselves to bears as another of their great teachers.
Hmm. I mean, I think that we absolutely have lost something vital by losing a connection to animals, where it feels weird to be a human animal on the landscape and to know that you should be able to go out into the woods and see how all these animals interact with each other, but it's so difficult to do in modernity that I feel like we begin to feel alienated from the planet on which we live, because when someone lives in the city and they never get to see wild animals just living, then what is there for them to
Well, it's really easy to stop
understand?
feeling like an animal as a human, right? You spend so much time in this thought space of word sounds and symbolism that you lose touch with your animal nature.
And
And
it's
that
like,
could mean physical activity, that could mean healthy sexual relationships. Like, there's all these deficits from forgetting that you're an animal.
yeah, and just domesticated animals aren't the same thing. Like
No.
there's something about the wild animal and the animal full of free will and self-determination on the landscape that is much more informative than our cat who literally just sits in front of the food bowl and cries. We
So
feed her enough. She just is a glutton.
in Jungian circles, they actually see. So in terms of Jung, okay, I'm going to put it out there. I don't see myself as a Jungian. The Jungians are the ones that get drunk at the bar every night. I'll have a glass of wine or cider with dinner once in a while. Okay, so that's where I'm the Jungian spectrum. Okay, but what the Jungians say is that the animals are still within us, and there's a response that you two may never have experienced. It's a response called a lizard response, and a lizard response is you've been with somebody and you caught them off guard and something unconsciously just erupted and they just like try to bite out at you. Okay. And it may have been nothing that you said, but it was something that was going on in that person's mind deep down. And they had this otherwise just absolutely dainty person and or charming guy, and this lizard response comes out. Okay. And but I'm sure you two have never, because not everybody experiences it, not every couple. But
I mean,
so
yeah, it's taken a lifetime to you still fail, but yeah,
Yeah,
aware that that's a challenge.
I am well familiar with my lizard brain, so yes, definitely.
okay, so that we have these responses. And it's so we have the animal is still within us. Okay, and it's just part of who we are. And the Lakota, their perspective is there's brother bear and sister or an aunt wolf. And even if you take away the those other animal brothers and sisters, what do we have today? We watch Disney. We watch animals, or we watch Sesame Street. Well, I'm not sure if Sesame Street's on anymore, but in my time, we watched Sesame Street. We watched all
Yeah, it's
these
still going.
manufactured animals teaching us ways of the world. Then Barney came along, and I don't know what Barney is, but it's an animal. Call Barney an animal, dinosaur, right? So we still have animals in our world teaching us as young, because that's what kids like to listen to. Maybe
Now,
adults, not so much. Sorry.
something kind of strange happened though, in the Greek era, where the different aspects of our spirit, like our rage and our lust, and these things were given personifications in these gods that were humanoid, right? Like Mars and Jupiter, and of course, we even still name the planets after these things. But those strike me as particular animalistic aspects of being a human being as well. Like you would say, I'm possessed by the rage of Mars or something. I assume in those periods, but today, you're just like, I'm feeling angry. You break. You have this lizard brain experience. Why do you think that they abandoned that animistic sense and gave human personification to them?
First, I'm going to tell you, a 1 minute story. I was on a podcast a few months ago, and it was a psychological Jungian type of podcast. And he had a guest on prior to him who was an actual analyst. And he asked a similar type of question without giving Mars. And he said, and she said to, what is the Greek mythological character that you relate to most? Okay. And the answer to his question was really he just wanted to psychoanalysis. Okay. Now, Shilo, you're not a Mars guy. I just don't see it. It's not deep within your soul. But I see you more as like a Venus type. But but anyway, so what happened is
on my finer days, perhaps. Yes.
Okay. So what the Greeks did is they all these different myths are projections of the individual personalities. And so if you're going to be a warrior like Mars, or you're going to be a lover like Venus, these are two different, of course, personalities. And so people would then, I will fight with, or I will love with, or I will, have the strength of the centaur. So they're really doing the same thing. They've just created all these different stories. So it's an indirect way to say, will you be my Venus? You'd be slapped in the bar today, and if you was at work, you get fired for sexual harassment. But so that was their indirect way of expressing their world, expressing the other person, how you could be without saying, or could not be in some cases, without just saying that you're just too violent, or you're just too, you're coming on too strong. That was just their way of doing it. And I have a friend, and I'm not going to tell you his name, and what his mother writes books about female Greek goddesses, and she tells the story through the family story. The whole everybody in the family is involved in these stories, and that's her way of dealing with her cosmos in her space. And so she brings all these characters in. Her kids, become Greek characters, and that is one way of experiencing the world. Another way of experiencing the world is we put these characters on the silver screen, which is, of course, now the Netflix screen. That we put them out there, and we decide among ourselves, who do we identify with? Who do we not want to be? I mean, the age of Trumpism. I mean, a long time ago, he was this clever businessman, then became this monster. We put him on the screen, and so when we look at the who we think is the opposite of ourselves, we actually find a little bit of ourselves, and we find it through the movies we watch and the books that we read. And the ancient Greeks just did it through their own mythology, and they staged plays with these characters, and they told these stories through the night sky as they saw them, not as the mythology was actually born, which is really important. So back to class, if someone tells you a story, if they give an answer to a mythological question, what is their perspective? Did they read Perseus when they were 13 years old, as my daughter did, and that's where she drew her mythology? Did they pull out something out of Greek mythology, traditional Greek mythology, or do they have some indigenous tradition that they drew from, or did their mother tell them some mythology story about Andromeda? Because everybody has their own narratives that they use to explain who they are and where they should be in time and space, such as the Lakota in the Black Hills and these uppillated characters that travel around these distances.
Like, for me, it seems like the true value of mythology is that it can really point out how you should be living. And this is like one of the reasons I got really drawn into like old folk music and old blues music when I was a teenager and in my 20s. I just thought this was absolutely the secret to the universe, because these bit larger than life stories that are archetypical, where you see the same patterns playing out and you can actually learn how to live by learning what not to do, usually in the case of blues music or in some of these folk songs. Do you think that that's still alive and well in our culture today, in our
Absolutely.
society?
So we do, yeah. So songs is another way that we project who we are, and sometimes it's pretty nasty. I'm not getting down on rap and things like that. Ghetto rap, whatever it is. I'm not getting down, okay? But what you do hear in that is a lot of violence. There is a lot of violence, and maybe there's others that I haven't heard because I haven't heard that much. But what I've heard, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of violence, and there's a lot of identity politics of different sorts. Cops versus street kids and whatever, and those kids on the street have their stuff going on, and that's why they're projecting this in their music. So absolutely, we have it in our songs at different times. So Arlo Guthrie had his own struggles, and his struggle was against the agricultural boss, the man. And so we can go back in time, we can find who the opposite, who the Putin of sorts was for each period of time. And that is how, from my perspective, that's how we project it in our songs. But it's a way of unconsciously telling a story that doesn't offend the person in front of you or the society around you, to say, this is who I am. And the street rap, the ghetto rap stuff, they're saying we're hurting. That's what they're saying. This is a bad scene, and we need help. This is our story, and this is how we view the world. In the same way as people talked about whether it be the miners in country music, or it became the grape culture, the lords in Southern California. We each tell that we project it, and in a non-adversarial way. I remember someone when I was a kid said they liked John Lennon's Imagine song. Now, this person was a devout Catholic. She didn't get it. She loved the words, and unconsciously she's taken it in. Imagine there's no heaven; it's easy if you try. There's no hell above us, below us, above us only sky. And boy, that was it just took in those words, and unconsciously was realizing that maybe it is not as I've been told. For generations, and the priest tells it out in the altar. So
What's
we do have.
To me is like there seems to be like two types of people. Like one type of person watches a movie and then afterwards can't shut up because they're like, oh, that character sucked and I wish they would have done it. How could they not do this one thing? And like it's the same with music. I know people, actually I tend to associate with those types of people because like my friends, when we listen to music in college, we just sit around talking about like, oh, what does this mean? And like, how is this playing out? And what are the pitfalls of what happened in this song? And
which is really funny because whenever Shilo writes songs and I'm like, Shilo, what does this mean? He's like,
well, that's what I'm trying to get at, because I think that debate and that discussion is where the knowledge comes from. Because what you said is that we have to be able to talk about ourselves without putting ourselves on the pedestal, and by bouncing ourselves off of some untouchable, like large, like meta reality, which is what a piece of poetry, epic poetry, or a Netflix like epic movie or something, by bouncing our own reactions, like, oh, here's what I would have done, or here's what this person should have done. We're talking about ourselves.
It's like echolocating
100%. Yeah, I really think so.
Anastasia, you have to listen to the words. You have to interpret where Shilo is in that moment. At the end of this episode, do you play guitar or the keys? What do you play?
I play bass, and Shilo plays basically everything.
So Shilo at the end of this episode could like close it with a guitar number, something light and something deep.
I always do. The music that plays at the end of this episode is I played all the instruments on it. So there you go.
Okay, got it. Okay, something
got some
bringing
horns
the stars and
all that stuff.
Mythology and our journey through the cosmos.
But I mean, as a writer, I think that I feel the same way. Like I think that the best state of writing is not totally being in this conscious mindset about it's me, Shilo, writing this song and having these thoughts. It's like, I feel like I'm tuning into something else, which is a little incoherent, and I'm still going to write it down and try to like hammer it into something that flows and is enjoyable. But at the end of the day, sometimes I can sit back and be like, damn, like, what was that? What was I even writing about? And maybe I can make sense of it in the years that come or something. But I feel like it's that struggle between the listener, or let's say between the audience and the artist. There's this tension that's being released, which is healthy for the audience to experience, because in the same way when you're recounting these stories in the sky, it's like, how do I relate to what these gods are doing? How does this play out in my own life?
Well, there's a really interesting thing that we sometimes find when we watch movies, is that there's a genre of almost postmodernist movies where either nothing happens, or the person who is the main character, who isn't a particularly good main character in terms of how much they've figured out their life, just never really figures it out. You watch them and they keep making the same mistakes, and they end up on the far side of it, and they've still made the same mistakes, and it's this kind of this myth is almost like, well, you are who you are, no sense in really changing that. And I feel like there's a tendency to want to move away from moralistic stories, because we have this standpoint of, well, we don't want to put a foot on the ground to say, this is good, this is bad, this is how you should be, this is how you shouldn't be. And in the process of that, I feel like people are kind of adrift, because it's hard to tell what is the story you should be listening to, because it's not necessarily the most common story. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And if I was an analyst, I'd have like lots of things to say, but I am not an analyst to
well, you can occupy the position of
and,
analyst.
I'm not an analyst. I'm a naturalist, right? Like Darwin. And Darwin would never have evaluated, where you come from deep inside. But what Jung would say is that in the case of Shilo, you're projecting stuff for your unconscious. And what is your unconscious is everything all the baggage that you've been carrying with you for your whole life, the baggage that your parents dumped on you, the baggage that your teachers, threw in front of you in books, the baggage of all the movies you're taking in. It's not something you download from the sky, or from aliens, or I'm sure you've had a few of those guests. I know that's cool. It's all cool, but there's no downloading going on, guys. But it's in the architecture, it's in your art, it's in the poems, it's in other people's music, and it's all swirling around your head, and you then identify whether you're a feeler. I mean, Shiloh, maybe you're a feeler, or you're a thinker or a sensor, and you kind of, that's your valve, or the hole that you kind of put it through, and you black out some of this other stuff. But sometimes you just don't want to put out your story. You don't want to put out your pain, because then you become vulnerable. And that's just my my view of the world. But I'm not an analyst. I can actually get you in touch base with an analyst who's not going to analyze you, but would tell you some really good stories about other people that and it's James Hollis. James Hollis is the guy, and I'll get you in touch with him. And he's the foremost Jungian analyst. But he's healthy. He doesn't get drunk at the bar every night. He has a few drink with dinner or two, right? But he's not a.
Is this like a stereotype of Jungian analysts, that they're all heavy drinkers?
Well, no, I mean from the perspective of they're so deep into it, they don't see anything else. So they don't see the biology, they don't see the astronomy. It's because there are physical elements out there that don't fall into the psyche. So and that's what I kind of, whether you're drunk or you're sober enough to see that you're standing on the floor, and you're drinking out of a glass, because those are all elements in our space.
I mean, I think tapping into the pain is probably the easiest place to write from for anybody. I had a good look around at people who I'd sort of been idolizing who did that for their careers as artists, and it didn't seem to work out for them. Like, they died, or they were miserable. They were on their fourth marriage. If the only place you can write from is a place of pain, then you subject yourself to painful stimuli over and over and over again. And I just literally had a conscious revelation that I can't do that anymore.
You mean Adele, right?
Like so many artists, yeah.
We were listening to Rilo Kiley the other day, and Rilo Kiley has that kind of thing. She's
Jenny Lewis, yeah.
Well, we kind of came to the conclusion that they had similar.
That's her band. Her first band was called Rilo Kiley.
Sorry, not Jenny Lewis. Nico Case.
Nico Case.
Nico
yeah.
Case. We were listening to Nico Case and Jenny Lewis. I always get them confused because I kind of bin them in the same place. But both of them are these prolific writers, but the things that they write about just reflect a life that maybe is intentionally pushed towards chaos in order to maintain the ground from which you can write something, because people so easily resonate with pain. It's the hardest emotion to deal with because you want to be able to take that negative harmonic and diffuse it into the world, and the easiest way to do that is by resonating with those that are already sad.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see it in art all the time, where narratives of what the future could look like if it was amazing are less popular than the narratives of the just dystopian end that we're all headed to.
I think that's awesome. So you can imagine that we've all had these same emotions, these same dreams, these same passions for eternity, for like a very, very long period of time. Well, what the Lakota do is very interesting, is when they go around the Black Hills and they have these ceremonies, they're renewing themselves. They're releasing all this stuff into the night sky. They're releasing it from their bodies, and they dance and they sing and they pray and they do the Sundance pole, which is, it's not a fun place. They're letting it all go, and so that when they return for the new year, they're bringing a new. And the same way, New Year's Eve party, right? We're supposed to, let go. We're starting over again. And so these traditions are part of the human psyche that we can't let go of. We have Christmas. We have all these New Year's, Christmas, New Year's Eve ceremonies, and then we have a lot of vernal equinox ceremonies. So we've passed through the winter and we're reborn in the spring. I'm going to tell you a secret. Jesus was not born on Christmas. Jesus was not resurrected just around the vernal equinox, and John the Baptist wasn't born on the summer solstice. Now that is a secret that we should not let out to too many people. But what we're doing is we're talking about the cycle of the year, that indigenous peoples around the world have the same traditions, and ancient peoples, the Chinese and so on, because we have these. Whether we sing the songs, but we travel through the year, through the seasons. We travel through the darkness of the winter. That we have more melatonin. We're down. We're down. The salmon may like it because they're up and going, but we're down. We travel through all these seasons, and it's part of who we are. And that we express these things in our songs, and with Christmas songs. No one's had a really good Easter song.
I mean, from what I understand, the church came along and realized that the indigenous cultures in Northern Europe were already had festivals clocked to these various solstice events and so forth, and they were just like, all right, we have to align our holidays to these.
Exactly what happened. Exactly. A very interesting Iberian Peninsula where we have a lot of mountains that appear in these cave arts, and the Basque people, who are what we call them like the Native Americans of Iberia, they go back since time immemorial as far as we know. And the Basque have traditions of climbing mountains at certain times of the year, and they're actually the same mountains that we find depicted in the Upper Pillay cave art. That's interesting. Okay, that's like really, really interesting. Okay, and they're pareidolia mountains. So the one might be a bear, and another one might be something else. And then we find them depicted in art. So the Basques, same certain times of the year, they go up these mountains, and it's tradition. And actually, they go up at the nighttime. So it's really the potential heliacal rising of a constellation. And then, so the Catholics came along. Oh, actually, the Roman Christians, however you want to put it, they didn't like it because it wasn't very Christian. So they couldn't stop it because people kept going up in the middle of the night, and they didn't want to chase them up in the morning. So what they did was they put a temple, a Christian temple at the bottom, or place of offering at the bottom, and they put a cross at the top. And so people were then climbing these mountains to go to the cross, but in the same tradition they had been potentially for tens of thousands of years, because it's the same images in the Upper Pillay cave art, and it's the same time of year as well, which I can tell you could do through astronomy. Now, here you had a guest on a few months ago, and he talked about Göbekli Tepe, and you did right. Okay, what you did was you said, well, between the vulture stone and the so-called comic impact hypothesis, there's 1,300 years. They don't match. By the way, I've never heard anybody do that before, and that was good science and it was good investigative journalism. Okay, well, this is interesting. The Basque people, we know of there's no tie to any of the Indo-European languages, and it's like the anomaly, and no one actually knows where the Basque come from, except the Armenians, which are the people that potentially are the heir came from Göbekli Tepe. Armenians, going back for about 100 years, many language scholars have tied together the Basque language to Armenian. And the Armenians say that they brought the language to the west, to Iberian Peninsula, with agriculture 7,000, 8,000 years ago, something like that. Okay, and that's how the Basques got their agriculture. But here's the problem with that whole thing: is the Basques are still climbing the same mountains we can see these mountains in Upper Paleolithic cave art, and one of them is called Chindoki, and it's Txindoki, Chindoki. You go pick up Chindoki, and Chindoki looks like a once you see the cave image, you say, well, the cave image is obviously a straight-tusked elephant or some sort of mammoth, and you can say, well, the Basque have no word for chin. Doki means place, but the Armenians have a name for chin. It means bad. So fundamentally, it means bad place. So putting that together, plus Göbekli Tepe comes online about 10, 11,000 years ago, something like that, right? Cave art in Europe on the Iberian Peninsula ends 12,000 years ago, just like stops. Okay, and we could tie that into the Younger Dryas. I mean, it's fair game, right? So where did the people go? To a place where art just explodes, which is the Armenian Plateau. So I would say, back to what you had your guest on a few months ago, Martin Sweatman, is that the Basque left in different directions. One direction they left was the Armenian Plateau, and they brought the language, and they brought on this great art on these pillars. And then they later, as agriculture was developed, they spread out again. 12,000 years ago, we also find explosion of art in the Sahara. And we also find a DNA backwash in the Sahara. So prior to 12,000 years ago, there's very little rock art in the Sahara, but now it's like big art. It's huge. So I would say they're actually connected. And you had the guest on, you talk about that so-called the vulture stone. Well, the vulture stone, it's not a vulture and it's not an eagle because the head is round, and vultures and eagles don't have round heads, but humans have round heads. In fact, you won't find too many birds with round heads. Another thing about that is it has, of course, it has the eye, but it has the wings are a really bad fit for any size of a vulture. So it's almost like someone had wings they put on another character. And then you have this V-neck, which ties into human characters that we find on other objects from this Göbekli Tepe area, the artifacts. So what we probably have is we have a shamanic type of character, spiritual leader, who puts on the mask of the raptor, puts on the wings, and the whole leg thing, I just don't get it, okay? Well, we find the same tradition in Upper Paleolithic cave art. We find the hero who goes on this journey, who takes on the raptor. In the case, it's the juvenile eagle in the El Castillo cave, but we find different raptors in different caves. And so I would say that Upper Paleolithic tradition, the tradition at Göbekli Tepe on that vulture stone is in fact the same tradition that comes out of Upper Paleolithic cave art, where the hero goes on his journey and he takes on the character of these animals as he moves along. And that area of the country has a lot of, the Armenian Plateau has a lot of volcanic activities we see in the news every springtime or so. It's not a very good place for caves. Okay, so what you would do is you would create to find that new cave space outside the light, is you have these pillars, and that you could have a dome, some sort of dome roof, and on the pillars you've created your cave symbols that connect you between the underworld of the cave they created, their terrestrial plane, and to the night sky. So is it astronomy? I would say absolutely yes, but it's not the astronomy and the characters would be Hercules, who is the hero at one point in the journey, who then takes on the bird that's Aquila, and below him is actually, an uphill tradition, is a crab. It's a crab, and we could find that in pareidolia at the Rock of Gibraltar. At Göbekli Tepe, it's a scorpion. Okay. Now, in Greek tradition, they say that Hercules was grabbed by a giant crab Cornucus, and he kicked the crab away that ended up at the other end of the sky, which helps to tie into to other constellations the Cancer they previously had from other sources. And then they put a scorpion in its place. So the Göbekli Tepe, so-called vulture stone, ties directly into character-wise, and if it's also northerly looking from the center of the so-called circle. And so we're looking at where we would find Hercules. So it's not Cygnus, and it's not all these other things. It's a movement. Now the Basques say that there's no archaeological evidence to tie themselves to the Armenians. And the Armenians say it's obviously the language is the same. Okay, and the Basque scholars say no, you have to show us the archaeological evidence. And the archaeological evidence is in Göbekli Tepe. That shows up at roughly the same time that cave art ends on the Iberian Peninsula, and we find the same characters in the same, let's say, cardinal direction.
So I've been trying to figure out the rock art at the Rock of Gibraltar, and are you saying that they were where is the rock art that figures?
So we'll do two things. Well, first of all, there actually is a cave at the Rock of Gibraltar called Gorham's Cave that has rock art in it. But I'm looking at that rock art, and it's like
it's like highly stylized.
Yeah,
it's not representational.
That's not the one we're talking about. That's not the one. That actually, that's not the one I was talking about in the same order. But what we can do is, if you go to my, I've done podcast presentations on this, but I haven't done any conference presentations. So,
can we take this moment to take a quick bathroom break?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's do that. Give us 5 minutes.
Okay.
All right, what do we have?
So what we're looking at now, we're looking at the north end of the Rock of Gibraltar on the top image. And the bottom image, we're looking at a crab in the Gallery of Discs. And we haven't done the whole Gallery of Discs image. So what we see is the artist saw this space in the Rock of Gibraltar that became pareidolia that they then saw into the sky, they projected into the cave art. We can see.
And so this is a piece of rock that's actually on the side of the Rock of Gibraltar.
Yeah, it's naturally eroded away. We can see the claw.
I see.
Okay, the same image. So we're going to run through a few. We see the head of a horse, the peak of the head of a horse. We see the raised mane. And outside, you can see the other end on the Gallery of Discs. So the artist saw a pareidolia that they then projected into the cave. Here we have a monk seal, pretty cool monk seal, which became Cetus. We can find the head and the hind flipper of the monk seal on the north end of the Rock of Gibraltar. We find a spinning bottlenose dolphin. And the spinning bottlenose dolphin we can find as the beak, a bent beak. We can see the flipper and the dorsal fin and the lower fluke as they sort in the length of the pareidolia of the Rock of Gibraltar. Now this one gets really, really cool. Okay, so this is the Rock of Gibraltar. You're looking north, and on the south end you see the subsurface figure. And by the way, my illustration is drawn from both the current image or photograph as well as historical photos. So I took away all the people stuff. Okay, and I gotta actually. So what we're gonna do is actually I need to go to. I want to show you the whale. We're gonna okay, we're gonna find the whale. So we have this whale on the Gallery of Discs. Okay, and we have here on the journey, the belly of the whale. And what we find, we can look at the whale, and we can find that subsurface feature as the fluke. And we can find the rostrum, which is the mouth, and we find the dorsal fin as well. And so that fluke and this entire character of the whale as pareidolia would have been raised above 30 meters higher than than it is today. And if we look at it, we can actually see the pareidolia of both the whale and the dolphin overlapping each other on the Rock of Gibraltar. So I'm showing you a few quick images, and then these the ventral pleats for the whale became these striated lines in that space. We find.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So these images that you're pulling from the Rock of Gibraltar, where you're saying that you can see these features, are I'm looking at the before the pareidolia. I'm looking at the before Orion site where you have these listed, And they're listed as being found in this cave in Spain called El Castillo,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is in Basque country, which
Yeah, it
is
is.
very
Yeah.
far away from the Rock of Gibraltar.
Yeah, it's far away in the way that we would think today, but it's not in terms of like migratory people's terms. People in the Great Plains walked much greater distances than that. Tuareg and the Sahara walk over 1,000 miles a year on foot. So it's not. So this is where the story. This is the what's called the origin story is where the pareidolia is, and then they retold the story on the cave walls as they migrated along.
And so how old is the cave art?
34,000. The dating is about 34,000 years ago. And how that was done is, I believe that all of the Iberian caves are limestone, as is the Rock of Gibraltar. And calcium carbonate secretes from the limestone. And so the calcium carbonate is on top of the art, such as a red disc. You can then say it's as old as that. So when I say 34,000 years ago, it could be 34, it could be 35,000 years ago. And if you have a bunch of data points on a panel, and they all run about 34, 35,000 years ago of the calcium carbonate that's on top of the art, you can zero in and say, okay, it's in that region. So you can't go to the day. Yeah.
And so what do you think is the risk of erosion when you're looking at the Rock of Gibraltar? Because if it's 34,000 years old, the rock art,
Yeah.
and you're looking at the rock in the present day, are you concerned that you're seeing features that weren't there 30,000 years ago?
Well, I would say that I would see fewer features because of the erosion. I'd say I see fewer features. And so the case is I'm going to go back. So let's look at how we do the. And by the way, here's Jebel Musa across the Strait of Gibraltar, and you can see it as the female character. In this case, I would say that the erosion is the chin of the Jebel Musa that people identify as a character that fell off of the chin of the Gallery of Disc character. So yes, erosion would affect it. You would take away, but you wouldn't add more. And now we think about this concept of pareidolia and go back to the Devil's Tower. Bears, in our modern mind, we would not think that bears create those striations that come down from Devil's Tower. So in the minds of people, we find images, and those images have meaning to us. So these characters never existed in these rocks. It's what we walked away from that we found that we recreated and we projected into the night sky. And I'll find another one. See if I kind of think, and it's different for you. So go back.
And was there a point in time where you saw evidence that let you link the El Castillo art to the Strait of Gibraltar?
Yeah, so I'll actually give you a timeline. It wasn't the Strait of Gibraltar that I had first. It was Jebel Tobakal in Morocco, and I had that back in about 2015. That's a long time ago. Okay, I picked up Jebel Musa, which is just north of the Strait of Gibraltar. I picked that up about 2016. I picked up a bunch of other places about 2000, 2001, but I didn't pick up the Rock of Gibraltar till about a year and a half ago. And it wasn't the Rock of Gibraltar that I saw first. It was Jebel Musa on the other side of the strait. I recognized Jebel Musa as the character, the female character, the pregnant woman, because they both look at pregnant women. It's not a big leap. I recognized those two characters, and then I was working on something else. I put a pin in it, and I came back, 6 or 7 months later, and I started because I didn't realize how big the Rock of Gibraltar was because I was think what everybody else sees, right? The high point. And very quickly, I saw the pareidolia where the crab would be as it comes under the ledge. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And then I put a pin in it again, and I put the images on my wall, and I kind of look here and there. But then I said, I'm going to do a presentation on this, and I need to look a little further. And then I looked, and then I quickly realized the head of the horse, because I already had the head of the horse, and I realized the fluke underwater became the fluke for the whale. So we're talking that happened over like a 4-month period. once I started actually working on it. So it's not something that just like jumps at you, because you have to get multiple images of these areas to see different photographers, that you actually see details. And it took a while to get the images. And I'm still working out others in different places where I reach out to people who walk around with GoPros in these places, and because they're walking backwards, and they're that's the best place to actually find the image. And then I go into other sources of photographs like Shutterstock, and I try to find the best images I can, and I work from there. But these things happened over a very long period of time. But the first one was Jebel Tobakal, which is now Mount Atlas, and where the Phoenicians say they discovered astronomy. And so that was the first one. But yeah, it takes that one. I worked with someone else, and in a matter of it was hours, where we worked at a whole bunch of animals, because we already had the animals figured out in the gallery of discs, and so it was very quickly to start matching them, because it was easy.
What's the gallery of discs?
I think this is the one you were just looking at, the El Castillo cave.
Okay. So basically, you saw these. You had already gone through the gallery of discs and had found all of these characters where they were outlined in the rocks, and you were like, these are the figures that are present. And it's hard because it's almost like the cracks in the rock are part of the picture. Is that accurate?
So the original state of the panel is it was all covered with organic material and other mineral material. It wasn't white. And it would have been, there'll been flowing sort of lines. And then what the artist did was they cleaned off the panel to what you see as the white. And then what they did was they started engraving out, carving out the characters, such as the dolphin. Okay. And they, when I was first working on this, someone else helped me. When I was working on this, we figured that there's pretty amazing artistry that someone could come with all these animals. They can put them on top of each other, interlinking. But that's not, I realized that's not what they got it from. They found it in the pareidolia of the mountains, and these geological formations, where they found these characters, and then they literally lifted them onto the cave walls. So they started with the pareidolia.
I want to know about that first line that you made, because you said that the first thing that you discovered was the connection to Mount Atlas.
Yeah, Jebel Tobakal. Yeah, Mount Atlas. Yeah.
Jebel Tobakal.
Yeah.
And so, how did you make that first connection? You're looking at these cave drawings. You're seeing these shapes, and then all of a sudden you're like, it's on that mountain. Tell us how that happened.
How did I find something that I never could have thought was there, or nobody thought was there? It's a good question, and I'll tell you the story. And so I was working on the panel. I was in bed, and on the other end of my email exchange was a fellow named George Schaller. You can go Google George Schaller. GeorgeSchaller. Okay. And George, I had met him in my mid-20s when I was living in China. And he was probably in his 40s at the time, and he was doing a movie, I think about the panda or something. And I met him through a mutual friend in Beijing. And he didn't remember me. So I contacted George when I started working on this gallery, this project, because this is like really early. And I said to George, I said, hey, I've got these two animals, and I'd like to identify where they're from. And if one was the head of a lion. I didn't know the body at the time. The other was the head of an elephant. So George basically blew me off, and he says, these are the three people you should go talk to. So if they blew me, then all those people got back to me and said, George, they didn't want to talk to me. And can you help me out? He says, okay, but I'm not going to write any books about this. And he's still alive. He's worked for the World Wildlife Foundation. And he travels around the world, saving endangered cats. Okay, so George and I, we worked together for about a year and a half on this, between him going off to wherever finding endangered cats. And I saw what I believed was that, oh my God, I see a giraffe. And I sent the image off. I quickly traced it. I actually drew it, right? Sent it off to George. And he said, before he responded back to me. He said, I'm nothing. I got another giraffe. And then he's like, yeah, that's a giraffe. And he said, that's a Maasai giraffe. Maasai giraffes are in South Africa. And so so at that moment he realized there were no giraffes in Europe and Eurasia. Okay. We realized at that moment that we were in Africa on this panel, because all the other animals we identified, we had a horse, the crab, the two marine mammals, and some others. They could have been anywhere. I mean, they could have been European. We also found Iberian lynx, though, which was a European. And so George said, he came back and says, we're in Africa now. And I was like, whoa. So I said, well, who the heck's in Africa? Who's in, so we're thinking just on the other side of the strait. And so I get online and I'm typing in Morocco, because I'm not thinking, nobody's thinking South Africa, right? We were thinking that Maasai giraffes had traveled into North Africa, and there's giraffes in Africa today, North Africa today. And so I Google Morocco, and I Google all kinds of stuff, and I find out who lives in Berber people, Tuaregs live in Morocco. And then I just, through this whole thing, I see in the search I see mountains, lots of mountains, and they're actually the Atlas Mountains. Okay, the Atlas Mountain range with Jebel Toba colors. And there's one image that flips across my screen from a mountain climber, a Spanish mountain climber, and I just saw it. And it was because it was some of the characters, the head of the lion, the head of the Barbary ape, and the elephant were just really distinct. Once you see the elephant, you see the elephant. You can't not see it. And so that was it in that moment. And I was like, whoa. And it was absolutely a fascinating moment. And I sent this all back to George, and we're really excited and all that sort of stuff. And it probably was about it was about a year later I picked up. I started thinking about it later. Well, if that's a mountain, maybe there's more mountains. And I looked up tall mountains in Mulhassan, which is just above the Strait of Gibraltar. The Rock of Gibraltar is another tall mountain. We found all this other stuff. Okay, and that stuff on the Mulhassan is almost identical to the one you find in Gorham's Cave at Gibraltar. So they lifted this so-called hashtag and the characters they found in it, and they put it right on the rock in this Gorham's Cave at the Rock of Gibraltar. So they took that pareidolia, and so that was the second mountain. And then I was like, okay, I got it, right? And I went off to do this other stuff, and years later I came back and I picked up, as later in time or closer in time to us, people stopped going back and forth to Africa, and so they found their own mountains in northern Iberian Peninsula that they cued off the pareidolia. So one mountain is one animal, and another mountain is another animal, in the same way the Lakota did it. But the origin myth and the origin astronomy and the origin pareidolia are the mountains, these big mountains that have a lot of pareidolia, and that's where the cave art originally came from. And over time, it goes off into different areas. So the original point was an amazing moment about 2015, and I'm on this exchange with George, and so the really wacky thing about this is what happened recently. And really recently, about a month and a half ago, there was engravings were shown to the world through the so-called Rising Star Cave of Bones, and they said it looked like the stuff in the Gorham's Cave, but it was different. And so they blew it off and they said it's Homo naledi 250 to 350,000 years ago. Okay, and you can go to my Before Orion page, and there's a blog that says Rising Star Cave of Bones, and you can see my all the images as it goes across in there and how I interpret them. Well, it turns out that it's not abstract art, it's not Homo naledi, and it is exactly the same animals in the same orientation, the same order as this Gorham Cave. And those guys, they were so intent on having this Homo naledi interpretation, they never cleaned off the images to see what was below it. So you can pull up my blog at BernieForOrion.com, and you can find the blog, and you can find all these images. Well, what really blew my mind on that is there was a giraffe. And it's a giraffe in the same orientation relative to the elephants and the marine animals and the bear and some others, and a horse and an equid, as in the Gorham Cave. And so George was right when he was working with me years ago, it wasn't Maasai giraffe. It wasn't Maasai giraffe in the North Sahara where we find them today. It was Maasai giraffe in South Africa. So those guys have this Homo naledi team has a Netflix documentary coming out in the 17th. Okay. And their pre-peer reviewed papers were totally thrown away by the academia, and their peer reviewed papers were totally dismissed as well. And all the peer reviewed for the journal said, you guys you never dated this stuff. You never dated this. You're just saying Homo naledi there, therefore they made the art. You never cleaned off the images to see what was underneath them. You have no evidence of this. But what they are is they're a replica of the Gorham's Caves image at Gibraltar, which has the same, it's a square. It's a square versus the gallery disc, which is a rectangle. It's actually the same orient because the rectangle and the square, you see them slightly different, but it's the same characters that go around the panels. And so these guys within the last 24 hours, this Cave of Bones team has been just blown out of academia. They're completely disgraced. What you can imagine. One of the guys has a book coming out, and they have a Netflix episode coming out on the 17th. Well, about a month ago, they saw what I saw. They saw my interpretations, and so they've gone back into the cave, this so-called Rising Star Cave in South Africa, to clean off the images and retake the pictures. And they have people from National Geographic going into it. And so this thing emerged totally out of nowhere a month and a half ago for me, when it came out early last month they released this pre-peer reviewed journal to the world with a press release that put them on CNN and ABC and the Wall Street Journal, everybody's cover. It was and the paleontology and the archaeology community they just burst, because that's not how the process works. And they said, we promise you a peer-reviewed journal, which the reviews came out yesterday, and 10 out of 10 were thumbs down. Okay, but these guys.
So what do you think they're going to find when they go back and they clean the rocks? What do you think?
You're going to see exactly what I have in my blog, except there's going to be colors.
Interesting. So you think that there's just sufficient grime that's on the rocks that it's covering?
It's just silt, from the ground. Yeah, it's just silt.
Or so you're lodging a prediction here, because I was looking at
100%
at the Rising, because the images are faint. Like you show these rock surfaces and you trace out where the animals could be, and if I squint and I kind of turn my head, I'm like, I can see where you're pointing to.
Yeah, but
they're very hard to see, and so you're basically lodging an official prediction that when they go back and they clean it, that suddenly it will become significantly clearer.
Well, they've already gone back. They've already gone back. So they're taking better pictures, because they didn't take very good pictures the last time. They didn't clean it off. So what I have is, because I've studied this, so this Gorham etching that I've worked on since way back when they came out in the press, they said it was Neanderthal, because Neanderthals were allegedly only in Europe at that time 30,000 years ago. Okay, but that's now been pushed out back to 55,000 years ago, so that no longer is valid. And they said that they have this hashtag. To the press, they never released a clean image. They only had this dirty image. If you go online, you can see my webpage, you can see the clean image, but everybody else carries this dirty image. So I bought the rights to use and study the image from the photographer. That's how things are done, right? Outside of academia. And so I had years to study this thing. And I had it before Orion. I've done it in many programs since then. And so I know I've studied the clean lines on this panel. So to match it to the one they had is pretty easy. Now, with the people in South Africa, they had a dirty image. And they thought their first look was these two are the same, because they had obviously seen the one in Gorham in Gibraltar, but they had never seen the clean image. So they dismissed it, because their lines, as they saw them, weren't the same as the Gorham, the Gibraltar ones, because they didn't have a clean image. And in their so-called pre-peer reviewed paper, they showed their dirty image next to the Gorham's Etcham dirty image side by side. Well, that's like
What's the South African? So hold on. What's the South African image that you're talking about?
Oh, it's called so if you go to it's called Cave of Bones or the Rising Star Cave, and there's panel A and B.
Oh, sorry. The Rising Star Cave is in South Africa.
Yeah.
I see. Because I was looking at the. Okay, so the line etchings in the Rising Star, that hashtag looks like what's found on the Rock of Gibraltar.
Oh, it is the
Is
same.
that correct?
So it is the same, except it's up the hashtag. The animals are in the same orientation, but the hashtag is upside down, and there's a reason for that.
Is it because you're in a different hemisphere?
So that's another program that we need to actually do. We're in almost 2.5 hours. We're never going to get that in this time, but there's a reason for it. So they mixed it. So they didn't know what it was before, and so they had it. They're literally looking at two images that were upside down to each other, and they were looking at two dirty images. So this is going to be on Netflix, and this isn't going to be on Netflix because it came out. They had made the Netflix thing, and they did this huge worldwide media release before they actually knew it was in it, and then it got blown. They got thumbs down for all of their pre-peer reviewed and their peer-reviewed journal stuff. And so they sent, as of a month and just about a month and 5 days ago, they know it's there. And because they've seen
That's fascinating.
Because I don't, it's clean enough for me to see, but they were already going down this road. It's homiletti 200,000 years ago, spirituality made art as smart as modern humans. That was their narrative, which they got, thrown under the bus by everybody in the field related to it, both through the peer reviews and the media. And so by me saying we've put out Cave of Bones and Homiletti Cave, Rising Star, this video is going to get a lot of following on YouTube because nobody else is talking about it, because nobody else actually can talk about it. They talked about it a month ago, this total BS spirituality, Homiletti buried their dead story. And they made art, total nonsensical story that is in a very short period of time has been completely dismissed by everybody except that team. So by going to my blog, so that blog, in the last year, prior to that, my blog probably get like 5 people a month to look at it, my webpage. Thousands have been drawn to that. Thousands. So every time someone mucks up, like the Cambridge Dorian people or these people down in South Africa, and I'm like there, and I'm like Johnny on the spot, I put it out there, and people are over it. And so I have this big bag of material that, when the right moment comes, it's like it's there. But going back to George Schaller, by the way, George Schaller is in the hierarchy of wildlife biologists. He's the guy. He was a mentor to Jane Goodall and some others. So you put that into perspective. And when you first contact George Schaller for something like this, it's like saying, Tiger Woods, how's my stroke? And Tiger can say, maybe you should be playing putt-putt golf, or, I'll give you some lessons. Well, George saw the initial images, and he was really excited because the lion didn't have a mane. And actually, I'm sorry, it did have a mane, and lions in Europe, other European cave art, don't have manes. So that was like an interesting one for him. And then he recognized right away that the elephant, if it was an elephant, it wasn't a European elephant because they have a humped head. And then we actually whether it was a woolly mammoth, and we had to figure out what does a woolly mammoth juvenile look like. And we went through this. He sent me on this search. We figured out that even juvenile woolly mammoths have humped heads. Therefore, that is an African elephant. But there was still some, we need more evidence. But the evidence was the giraffe. And when he said Maasai giraffe, I just put it in the drawer. And because perhaps Maasai giraffes had migrated as far north into the Sahara. But when that Rising Star Cave of Bones, Homiletti thing came out last month, and I recognized the gory matching because I'm the only one who's actually studied the clean image and how it matched up upside down. That was a big moment.
Let's make sure that we have this clearly on the table. What you're saying is that there's a direct line of representation between a cave that is in northern Spain and a cave that's in South Africa, and that you can see this based off of an etching of the animals that are etched into the rocks in El Castillo, this hatch pattern in Gorham's Cave next to the Rock of Gibraltar, and then the South African Rising Star Cave. You're saying that the same representations of animals are found in all three places, which means that these people 30,000 years ago were making an arc of migration or cultural exchange from the southern tip of Africa to the northern tip of Spain, at least.
Yes, absolutely. Now, this is the interesting part of it, is that there's animals that are indigenous to both places in each other's art. Okay, so going back to this concept, the Saharan Tuareg walk over 1,000 years on foot. So how many years does it take to get from the Iberian Peninsula down to South Africa? Now, there's another thing that happened about 5 years ago, is with this new dating technique with the calcium carbonate, is cave art Indonesia started popping up dating just over 40,000 years ago. And before that time, because we didn't have the techniques were not available. Always people thought the Indonesian stuff, came much more recent times. But then so then did cave art emerge in Indonesia 2,000 to 3,000 years after Europe? Because that was the oldest state, so both parts. So it completely disrupted the story of humanity. And some people said, well, maybe it was in Africa. But we don't have, at that time, we didn't have any African cave art that dated, past 25,000 years ago. Or rock art itself. Rock art is very difficult to date outside, but cave art is much more easier. We had nothing. So the mystery of the Indonesian cave art can now possibly be explained through this now South African cave art. But what I don't see is I see the sort of pareidolia type of characters, but I don't see the same pareidolia characters from Indonesia as I see in the other ones. And that's partly because we only have like 2 or 3 specimens of Indonesian cave art that's dated after 40,000 years ago, or even really dated after 25,000 years ago. They don't have enough images to show the breadth of this. It could be, but we don't have it yet. But I would say that sooner or later we're going to find some more images, and we're going to possibly find some common characters, so that the journey was not just north to south as one would take the Pisces through both the dolphin and the whale in the opposite direction, but the journey perhaps could have been to the east as well, which changes the story of who we are as a species and how we came to be. So, did we leave Africa? No way we didn't leave Africa, because we still had exchanges back to Africa at least 35,000 years ago. And the Gorham etching is about 35,000 years ago. So and I would say this Homo luddi thing, that I bet that those artists, because there's there's a lot of details there. The artists, maybe they knew each other, or maybe they were close cousins, because there's too many details in the images that they have. There's some slight differences, but there's just too many details. These people were not thousands of years apart. They were close. They were definitely close.
And so this claim is a pretty big reimagining of Rising Star Cave, right? Because Rising Star Cave is supposed to be much older. I'm looking at it right now, and they're saying that they found Homo naledi there, and so that's like 330,000 years old. And you're suggesting this is actually something that's much more recent.
Yeah, so Homo naledi, I have no issue with Homo naledi being 230 to 300,000 years ago. I have no issue with that at all. But what they did find on the second visit into the cave, when they had better photography, they took images and they found broken fossil bones on the surface. So therefore, somewhere between, how long does it take the bones to get fossilized? I don't know, is it 100,000 years? So some point after those bones were fossilized, someone had been in that cave, and someone had walked and they broke those bones. The photographers swear they didn't do it. So someone had been there. And my bet is that it was Homo sapiens. And so did we come out of Africa, or we just kept these cultural exchanges? So Homo sapiens were there, because we have the exact same cave art. And we can date the cave art because we can date it in Gorham's cave, and we can date it through the El Castillo cave. So those are our two dating
Is
points.
it agreed upon that there's art in Rising Cave, or
Oh yeah,
are you
there's
okay?
no question anybody agrees on the rising art. What's now has been thrown on the bus. It has. There's no proof. There has been no proof that has anything. It's the peer reviewers and the archaeologists, paleontologists overall have said that you have no evidence that that's tied to Homo naledi. You just can't say this fossil bones of Homo naledi. They found like 30 specimens of Homo naledi. I mean, it's real, but they made the stretch and said these are connected. Actually, when they're not. So there was no destructive testing done on the images to determine dating or non-destructive testing. They actually never cleaned off the image, so it has the dust on top of it.
Got it.
Never cleaned it off.
I mean, it's tantalizing. We talk on the show all the time about the ways in which these archaeological records overlap, and they're so hard to deconvolve. And when you find evidence of bones and you find the bones next to something,
Yeah.
is it actually a representation of the fact that the bones are related to the thing that you see or not? Like, there's a saying in Russian that's really good for this, which is like, you wouldn't believe what it says on the fence, but underneath the fence, there's just a wood pile. And it's like, it's in reference to the fact that you can have crazy graffiti on the wall, but that doesn't necessarily reflect in any way of the use that's going around the wall. And it's just, it's a hard thing to come down with certainty on, because even the pictures that you're posting on your blog and the analysis that you're doing, I'm like, it's tantalizing, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time being like, I'm going to carry this forward into the world as God's truth.
Sure.
But I love that you are working on it from outside the academy. The fact that this is just something that you're passionate about and that you continue to work on it and you're finding people to collaborate with and uncovering new ground, because that's what our show is all about. That's what we're most interested in. And so I think it's really cool.
Well, it was a complete accident. I couldn't have been looking for it. And it goes back to George said, it's a Maasai giraffe based on the horns. And I'm like, I was out there, but when he said that, I was like, maybe we'll return to that in the future. But so yeah, I have 2 conferences in September, but I already have the abstracts approved, right? Like I wanted to bring this in so I can like do them podcasts and stuff, and I'll probably do some like presentations at universities and talks. But I don't have a place other than writing a paper, which it's not going to get the window. I don't have a place to present this until like next April or May, because all my conferences, I might get in a symposium to pull this off as the whole presentation. But what I'm still working on is the pareidolia origin of some of those images in South Africa, because I see the same thing with these Iberian images. So logic would say we've got some of them down there. And but yeah, it's exciting stuff, and archaeologists always push towards an earlier date. Or a later date. They want to find deeper in time, because then they could say it's first, it's earliest, it's the best, whatever. And that's how you get press. Just another cave art images doesn't get you anywhere. But the big story out of this one, which they didn't know back when, but they definitely know right now, is that it ties together South Africa with Europe 36,000 years ago. And so we didn't migrate out of Africa. We had people that stayed in these places, and they had cultural exchange, and that becomes the story out of that, which is absolutely it's fascinating to me. It's kind of what wakes me up in the morning.
You gotta lead with that. I feel like it's like that's an incredible statement, and a hard statement to get somebody to accept at first blush.
Sure.
But I think it deserves to go up front.
And if you're looking for somewhere to present it, we are hosting our first conference next April, which might be a little late, but we are going to be bringing together people to talk about all of our favorite subjects, and it's looking like a pretty killer lineup so far. And so that's going to be April 6th and 7th of next year.
Where?
And if you don't have anything on the map, you should consider
Oh, okay.
dropping by.
Well, actually, I have
Austin,
lots. I have
Texas.
in addition, I have a lot of material that I've never presented. I have a lot of cool material I have presented that would be new to your audience. So yeah, we could. So we're talking Ashland, right?
And no, we're going to do it in Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas.
Yeah, because the eclipses we're timing it with the eclipse, which is going to be the Monday after the weekend we hold the conference. So hopefully we'll have a little event for the eclipse as well. But Austin's a pretty happening town, so I think it'll be
So
we'll
April
play
6th
some
and
music
7th?
there. And Yep.
6th and 7th, yep.
So remember, I told you I had people that came in towards my defense early on, including with the IAU, and one of them was the recently deceased former eclipse hunter. And so that was he said, I want to hear this, and that worked out pretty well. But anyway,
Who was the eclipse hunter?
yeah, we'll look at that.
Who was
But
the eclipse hunter?
you gotta look that one up. Who was the master eclipse hunter?
All right.
Can't give you everything. You gotta,
You'll have to come back. It was really, you have a really easy way of presenting, and it's clear how much you love this stuff, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Yeah, we covered a lot of space.
And there's still more left to cover, so hopefully we'll talk more.
Thank you, guys.
It
was a pleasure. Anything you need
Bernie.
from me, just let me know.
All right, we'll do.
All right, take
Have a
care.
great
Bye-bye.
rest of your day.